Well, hello and welcome back to this third and final episode all about the kitchen setup. And in the last episode, we covered this, the Dometic CFX 375 dual zone fridge freezer. And I mentioned that there were some interesting learning points that led to the current setup that I have right now. So when I was in Golden for episode 2 of the Rental Bike series, I actually had this with me. And I had just got it like a day before that trip and I was super excited. And as mentioned in the previous episode, there's 2 ways that this fridge can be powered. The first is that 12-volt AC lighter, and the second is the 115. Well, this F-150 does not have any power takeoff for 115 in the back here. And it also does not have a cigarette lighter. However, in the rear seats of the cab, there is one of those 12-volt outlets. So I got a 12-volt extension cable for that outlet, and I ran it underneath the tonneau cover back here into power the fridge freezer. And in the fridge freezer, there are different settings where you can set for the battery level protection. And I had it in the highest level of protection because the starter battery in my truck was getting quite old and I didn't want to stress it. However, I ended up discovering a phenomenon through that called voltage drop. And as the fridge compressor tries to spin up, it pulls a higher amperage. And what ends up happening is if you think about electricity like fluid dynamics, it's like trying to suck more water through a narrow straw. You need a bigger straw, and that's the gauge of those wires. And when it tried to pull that harder draw, you get a resistance. And that resistance in an electrical system ends up causing the volts to drop. So what happened was the fridge was thinking that the volts in the starter battery were actually dropping, even though they weren't. And so what I ended up having to do is to lower and lower the threshold potential further and further and move the fridge freezer into the truck to shorten that distance to that 12-volt outlet just to get it to run. However, by dropping that battery level protection down to the point that I had to, what ended up happening? Well, it killed the battery. So I knew that powering this fridge freezer for extended durations off the starter battery was probably not going to be in my best interest. I think this is more than acceptable if you want to cool it down at home or just even as you're driving out to somewhere. But it's worth noting that it's not the most insulated product. And so if it's 25-degree heat outside and it's not able to constantly be running, it'll go from minus 15 degrees Celsius to plus 10 in an hour. So for me, what that meant was if I wanted to go out and do multiple days of consecutive mountain biking, I needed to invest in a house battery or a deep cycle secondary battery. Now, the magic piece of the puzzle is actually this blue box right up here. And this is a Victron Energy Orion TR Smart 121230 DC to DC charger. Oh my gosh, what is that? Let's break it down. Victron Energy is the company. The Orion TR is the series. 1212 means 12 volts in, 12 volts out. 30 means 30 amps. That's the higher of the two. So I'm future-proofing this because while this lead acid deep cycle battery probably can't handle those full 30 amps, in the future, should and when I get a lithium ion, that will take all the amps that you can give it and charge much faster. So this is future-proofing it. And a DC to DC charger simply means it's DC or direct current in, which is what your alternator puts out from your vehicle, to DC out, which is the house battery here. And because the fridge can run on AC, that 115 house, or the 12-volt DC, we can just keep it all as a DC system. So we can see here underneath the hood, this is the power terminal of our starter battery, or the battery for the truck. And what I've simply done is added the 12-volt power cable starting here from the common 12-volt source at the battery. That way there's no fancy plugs or tie-ins, and it's just a nice simple eyelet that I used on one of the pre-existing terminals. From here it runs down along a secure bracket into the actual vehicle frame rail, all the way to the back of the vehicle, up into the box, around the box on the inside, to the battery in the back. So now this power cable comes down and it goes into the input of the DC-DC charge controller. Then it goes out to the actual house battery. From the terminals of the house battery, we have a connector with a female version of the 12-volt plug, and that is what the fridge plugs into. From the Orion TR, we also have a ground cable that goes to the ground on the actual battery. And from there, we have a ground cable that goes from the battery to the actual vehicle chassis. So they do share a common ground. The Orion TR series does come in isolated and non-isolated. This is considered a non-isolated. My understanding is the only benefit is the isolated can prevent from, I think it's called ground looping, but sharing the common ground here is not a bad thing because I think that's only really advantageous for sensitive electronics. So I mentioned in the previous video that the Dometic fridge freezer is capable of monitoring input voltage. And that's good because in essence, you don't need a separate battery status monitor because the appliance is doing that for you. And again, it does this so that it's trying to protect whatever battery it's set up on. And again, as mentioned, there are 3 different levels of protection. The highest if it's a starter battery or the vehicle battery, and the lower 2 for if it's a deep cycle independent house battery like this is. And that's really valuable because that input voltage is essentially your battery health. And so even if the fridge freezer is not running, you know what voltage the battery is sitting at. Now, I had a lot of help with this setup from a business in Calgary here called Canadian Energy. This is not a sponsored video by any means, but I do want to extend thanks to them. And what they were telling me is that there are a lot of different sort of anecdotal reference charts with regards to voltage and actual state of discharge on a house battery like this. However, it is worth noting that a lithium-ion can discharge up to 100%, whereas a lead acid, a flooded lead acid like this deep cycle battery is, can only really discharge up to about 50%. So keep that in mind. Now, you might be wondering, how does this actually protect me against driving down the road, turning off my vehicle, and having the fridge drain the house battery, which is directly connected to the starter battery? Well, that's kind of the beauty of this Orion TR, the smart part of this DC-DC charger. Now you can go into their app and you can specifically set up exactly what you want your voltage cutoffs to be. So you can have a low voltage cutoff, which is like an absolute basement where it's not quite sure what's going on, but it will definitely disconnect it. But it also has a vehicle shutdown detection feature. And what this feature does is you can set it up based on monitoring the input voltage that you're seeing from your vehicle, from your vehicle's alternator. And it can tell at a certain threshold when it's most likely running, and it will then have a delay, a time delay that you can set. You can also set a guaranteed voltage. So if you're getting 13.8 volt, guaranteed your truck is running because your house battery, you know, is only sitting at 12.6 at the best of times. If it falls to that 12.6 volts, then you know that that's the standard float charge of your actual house battery. And so you know that at that point, your vehicle is most likely not running and to shut it off. And that's the beauty. It makes for a very simple setup that offers all the protection from your vehicle and provides all the performance for your fridge to run at its maximum, pulling off this battery. Now, for sense of context, this is a Group 31. I purchased it pre-owned, but it's fairly new, and it is rated to 105 amp hours. So if we estimate that that's about 52.5 amp hours at that 50% discharge rate, and we know once this is at temperature, it usually pulls about 1 to 1.4 amp hours per hour, then what we can say is that this at 52 hours will last us anywhere between, say, 35 to 50 hours of actual battery capacity, which is roughly 2 days worth. And I can say that I've actually pushed it pretty close to that 2-day mark where I parked and camped for a couple of days, didn't idle the vehicle at all. It is worth noting though, the more you open and close these doors, the more cold air you're letting out, and thus the more that the compressor has to run. So that 1 to 1.4 amp hour per hour is an average. And again, you can monitor that in the Dometic app. And one final advantage to this setup is that having it hooked up to your vehicle in this way essentially acts as a trickle charger. So every morning that you drive to work and every night that you drive home, you're just trickle charging this deep cycle battery just a little bit, which is the best thing that you can do to maintain health of a battery. And all those charging parameters are going to be set in that smart charger. Now, there is a product called a voltage sensitive relay, or a VSR, which has a similar sort of cutoff feature that the Orion TR smart charger has, in that once it falls below a certain voltage, which is consistent with what your standard float charge on the starter battery would be, it disconnects. And so you might be thinking, well, why spend a few $100s on this Orion charger? Well, the reason is those phases of charging. So this is not a single phase charger where it's going to put only one type of voltage into your battery. In fact, if it doesn't have those different volt stages, then what you can end up doing is damaging it. So if you spent good money, a couple $100s or more, batteries are certainly not inexpensive. The last thing you want to do is to damage it. And so what's really nice about this Orion TR smart charger is that, as mentioned, you can sort of future-proof yourself. So should you ever decide to get, say, a camper, like a pop-up camper, or you want to do a van conversion, this hardware will absolutely port into that no problem whatsoever. It's essentially the same setup. So having the protection features for that battery itself, that's going to be really key to make sure that this is a safe and long-lasting setup. So a few little extra suggestions or things worth considering are, whenever you're running a 12-volt power cable through or against or next to any kind of other metal or that could potentially cut it, you want to make sure to wrap it. Now, you can buy just your standard electric wrap to sort of bulk that up. You can also buy like a fibrous wrap. And last but not least, you can buy sort of like a corrugated tubing that you can cut to length in those sections. As well, when you're mounting anything into the body here, try to keep it up out of the way. You can zip tie it. However, what would be best is if you get a rubber isolated mounting ring, and that way you can secure it up and out of the way so that something like a shovel or a sharp toolbox or something like that doesn't inadvertently cut it and short circuit that wire. Lastly, you might also want to consider adding fuses in line. So a fuse up by the battery terminal or a fuse right before your DC-DC charger. Again, in case any section of that wire shorts out, it will blow those fuses and protect all your equipment down here. At the moment, I don't have that, but that will be coming at some point in the future. So in the end, if you are considering a Dometic fridge freezer or a ARB or any other brand fridge freezer like this, I would certainly encourage you to look into a house battery situation to make sure that you're going to get the full enjoyment out of this product. Because if you are relying on that starter battery, you may end up having a similar experience to what I had in Golden, which was not a positive one. So if you have any questions whatsoever, I can appreciate that we covered a lot in a very short period of time. So please let me know down below. And if you found this entertaining, informative, or helpful in any way, please consider subscribing. There's going to be plenty more videos like this to come. So thank you very much. You take care. Bye for now.